Scott, welcome to Clandestine Whisky.
Thank you very much. I appreciate having me on.
No, thanks for taking the time. I think our viewers have actually hopefully read the article in the magazine. So I really wanted to go on some more personal details. And I know that you really first had an idea in your head. You'd worked in a vineyard when you're at school, which had a little bit of drinks trade. Then I believe you're actually Bushmills Distillery in Ireland, where the seed was planted. Tell me, how old were you at that stage?
So let's see. Well, I worked in the winery when I was 16 years old, so quite young. And that was my job during high school before I went to college. But then as I was an adult, in my mid 30s, I guess we really started to get interested. My wife and I, in particularly Scotch whiskey. Single malt whiskey was, having a great heyday here in the U.S. And so we would make trips over, and we were in Scotland, we were in Ireland, and it was in Ireland, visiting Bushmills whiskey, just as regular tourists, that we, are standing there in that factory, looking at all those pot stills, and it's a huge facility, all of Bushmills' worldwide production in this one facility. And I looked at that, and I kind of spread my arms out expansively and said, I want this. This is what I want to do. And so I was at that time in a white collar desk job, working in a government contractor building in a cubicle with fluorescent lights and no windows, and doing PowerPoint charts all day. And so I was like desperate for some change in my career.
Yeah, fantastic. And what's actually great is that your wife is actually the distiller, which is fantastic. So, I mean, was she actually excited by obviously she had a degree in chemical engineering, and obviously distillation is part of that. Did her brain start whirring as well at the same time as yours?
Yeah, basically, it's funny because she's a wonderful check on my ambitions sometimes, and that needs to be done. And so I was excited about starting a distillery with little sort of practical, idea about how to get going on doing it. And knowing she's a chemical engineer, I said, well, you could make our whiskey. You could be the master distiller. And she quite brusquely, poked me in the chest and said, I know I can make your whiskey, but can you make money making whiskey? And so the challenge to me from her was, you need to write a business plan and prove to me that this is a venture that we can support ourselves with, and make money on. And it's not that's not a trivial request. It's a very difficult business with a lot of regulatory impediments to distribution. If I was just making strawberry jam, I could sell that anywhere I want, at a farmer's market, in a grocery store, whatever. But with whiskey, just here in the US, there's 50 different states, 51 if you count the District of Columbia. And each one has a different set of laws for how we sell whiskey in those states. It's a very difficult proposition. And so that was her challenge to me: write a business plan, and then we'll see.
I feel your pain. And I've got a liquor license here in the UK, and it's literally a day's course, which is super easy. Basically, don't serve alcohol to someone who's drunk. Make sure they're over 18.
Right.
You have to have a premises license, which is an application form to the council, and it's done. It's just a really simple process. So actually, the room I'm in now is a licensed premises for off sales, and incredibly easy. But but when you very first started up, I know you're in an ex-car showroom, is that right? In the main street in town?
Yeah, that's correct. You guys would probably call it High Street. We call it Main Street.
Yeah.
So right downtown in our little town of 8,000 people, we're in a historic building. That's where I am right now. The building is 100 years old this year, and it was built in 1921, which is a really interesting time for a distillery to have a building in. 1921, of course, was the first full year of Prohibition in the United States. It was a time of great change in the United States, coming out of the 1800s and moving into the 20th century. So, you know, it was built as a car dealership back when people were still using horse and buggy in town. So these horseless carriages, that's what it looked like back then, were sold in this building. And they sold cars here for 51 years up until 1972. So, you know, quite a long time. This was a car dealership where people could buy Buick cars. And so we kind of love that history. And repurposing it as an industrial distillery then was quite in keeping with the character of the historic nature of the building, which is something that was important to us as well.
And also, you know, I think, you know, Doctor, obviously you went to the bank, you got the finance. Was the majority of that finance used in buying the distillation equipment? So what proportion was spent on actually the building and beautifying that? Because at that time, I don't believe you could actually have retail sales.
That's correct. Yeah. So actually, at the very early stages, you know, we took the business plan that Becky challenged me to write, and the first thing I had to do was convince her that it looked feasible. And she did decide that it did look feasible. And so her ace in the hole was to tell me, you know, well, let's take that business plan to the bank and let's get some financing. Yeah. So basically, you know, we went to the bank, and this was 2008, 2009, that time frame. And so this was the time, you know, the great economic recession, you know, too big to fail. Companies here in the United States like Countrywide Mortgage and Lehman Brothers were completely going out of business. So Becky, of course, thought, well, of course, the bank will say no. And then I will have been the loving and supporting spouse. And I didn't have to tell them no, the bank did. So we went to the bank, showed the business plan. And a few weeks later, the bank called us and said, we've been approved for a $250,000 small business loan. And we were absolutely dumbfounded. I think Becky was like, oh no, now we really have to do it. You know, we had literally money in hand. And so we immediately took that money and began buying the equipment. That was the largest thing. Renting a space. So not the building we're in today, but we started in a small warehouse at the beginning. And we had one pot still, one mash tank. We had big plastic tubs that we used for fermenters. And we started quite humbly in that little bitty space, not much bigger than an American moonshine operation here. So, and then it started to grow from there.
And I think at the time there was only, in 2009, there was only 9 distilleries in Virginia, as opposed to like sort of 70 now. I just have interest. The bank that you went to, is that like I'm not familiar with all the banks, was that a state type bank that you got the loan from?
It was a local bank, so a community bank. Yeah. So
I'm wondering if the success that you achieved has actually led the path, opened up gates for the banks to lend to the other distilleries as well. If you were really
well, quite definitely. Definitely, because when we went to the bank, you know, the first question they said was, well, what's a distillery? And so, you know, they knew what a winery was. So we said, well, it's kind of like a winery, but we're making whiskey, not wine. And they didn't know anything else apart from that. They didn't know, you know, that there's a completely different set of processes from making whiskey and wine. And so that at least they knew we were making something you put in a bottle. I mean, that was about all they knew. And so, you know, we had to educate the bank. But, you know, the nice thing about the local banks is you're talking to a person who lives in the community, who knows some of the people, you know, like the mayor of our town and people like that, who can speak for us and vouch for us rather than some big faceless, you know, multinational bank that we would deal with.
Yeah, absolutely. So you got all the stills in process, and we're going to come on to a vineyard friend, a winemaker friend in a minute. But I know that I think you started distilling, I believe, in January. Then before you could sell any products, you're making a gin and sort of a moonshine as well. You had to get relisted in Virginia, ABC.
ABC, that's correct. Alcoholic Beverage Control.
So you literally, your whiskey had been barreled for like 6 weeks, and you had to take it to them. You had to literally make up labels on your home printer to take the gin and the moonshine to them. Had your presentation, and then you get the phone call, the letter back some weeks later. We'd like to take the whiskey.
Yeah,
it's just my mind is just whirring. I mean, Ailey, the product you delivered would have been completely different to the one you actually finally delivered as a product.
Absolutely correct. Yeah, we were at once, hooray, we have a customer, and oh no, they want the whiskey. It's like we need more time, and we didn't have time.
Yeah.
In Virginia, you get 2 shots per year to get on the shelves, and the next one was for the November listing, and we would have simply run out of money before then, if we hadn't had a product to sell. So the whiskey we started selling was a month and a half old. It was brown, it was tasty, and it was good. It was good enough to sell, and people really liked it. And as we got older, it got older, and we were able to get it to a point where now today we're quite pleased with where it's at. It's a beautiful whiskey, winning all kinds of gold medals and whatnot. But it was very, very early and very young in the early days, those early batches. But that was simply out of necessity. At that next appointment in November, we were able to get the gin listed and on the shelves as well, and that helped a bit with cash flow as well. But in the early days, they took the whiskey alone, and that was really something.
Yes, it's absolutely amazing. And for people who don't know, haven't read the article yet, you're actually using just making rye whiskey, and all the rye actually comes from a 150-mile radius of the distillery. And you're really
That's
trying to
correct.
get back to the heritage, because Virginia is arguably the first place that whiskey was made in America, which is just absolutely amazing. And to take on these organic rye and just really making it as it would have been made back then, what a wonderful thing.
That's exactly right. Yeah. So a lot of people don't realize, even here in America, that Virginia is the birthplace of American whiskey. So the very first permanent English settlement in America was in Jamestown, 1607. And a gentleman named George Thorpe started making whiskey there right away, right? And so we're all Brits at that time. And for nearly 175 years, that rye whiskey was the king of whiskey in Virginia, and predominantly in what we call the mid-Atlantic. So basically Virginia, Maryland, Pennsylvania, up into New York, that key area of the colonies. So if you were down south, you were probably drinking something else like, say, peach brandy. But for nearly 200 years, then rye whiskey was the king of whiskey in the colonies. Now, in 1776, we have a war with Great Britain. King George got quite pissed off at us for having this war, and he cut off the #1 supplied spirit in the U.S. at that time, which was not whiskey, it was actually rum. Rum was the predominant spirit in America, and when he cut off the supply of molasses, sugarcane, and rum from the Caribbean, then rye whiskey in America had a tenfold increase in 10 years. So it became an industrial product. It became the predominant whiskey in America throughout the 1800s. And that's really important, because that was the key time when cocktails were being developed, things like the Manhattan, the Sazerac, all these wonderful cocktails. And it was rye whiskey being used in that. So if you were drinking whiskey in Washington, D.C., in Virginia, in Philadelphia, in New York City, you weren't drinking bourbon, you were drinking rye whiskey. And nobody in America knew about that in 2009. And that's the story we wanted to tell with what we're making. So what we want to make is a true Virginia style rye whiskey. And that's what we use. Local, in wine, you'll talk about terroir. So we use local grain, which has its own flavor, different from Midwestern grain, local barrels, local climate, local water, all of that goes into making a very, very unique rye whiskey.
Yeah, it's absolutely fantastic. I've only tasted your cask strength at the moment, and it's absolutely wonderful. I just wanted to touch on your barrels. I know you started, I think, to have some Virginia oak, but you have been using oak barrels from Minnesota, which is obviously very, very cold. How does the coldness, how does that affect the oak? Alien, it's growing. It must be a lot slower growing, I'd imagine, in Minnesota. But then what happens about actually aging the staves? Are they aged in Minnesota, or are they aged down in Virginia? And you've got a Cooper down there that you work with.
We have both now. So we have a Cooper in Virginia, we have a Cooper in Minnesota, and the wood is actually similar to each other. So Virginia and Minnesota wood are very similar in their nature. But quite different from where most of the whiskey wood comes from, which is Missouri. And so, Missouri provides for all the big guys, Jack Daniels and Jim Beam and all those guys. So having the northern wood, it is a tighter grain. And so it just provides a whole different flavor profile. that we're getting. It's a real nice softness. There's definitely that caramel flavor that comes from the wood, the vanillas, the toasted nuts kind of flavors. Um, but as the barrel contributes 50% of the flavor, we had to be very choosy in the barrels that we wanted to use, because it truly is an ingredient in the whiskey.
Yeah, absolutely. Just going back a few years, when you first started, you needed some product to actually distill, and winemaker Doug, you gave him a call and he said, "Hey, I've got a barrel of whatever." He brought it down, you distilled it, and you basically started making brandy. I guess that was the first distillate that you made. And I think now you actually age some of your whiskies in those barrels which have aged, held that brandy.
That's correct. Yeah. So that brandy was actually a pear brandy. It was a pear wine that he brought us, and we made a pear brandy out of it. And today we do age actually not much of the whiskey in the pear brandy barrels, because the pear is a very delicate flavor. So we introduced that actually into some of the gin we make, and we make an Old Tom style of gin in those pear brandy barrels. So it's a barrel aged gin that's really, really lovely. Yeah, Doug, it was Doug Fabioli, who's a local winemaker here, who really saved us, because we needed to run something through the still for the first time and had not yet had time to make a rye mash. And so Doug said, "Well, I've got 50 gallons of pear. I'll be right over." And it was great fun. It was a really neat thing, and a nice little aspect of that story was at the end of it, Doug had stayed for the entire distillation, which was 6 hours or so. And at the end of it, I said, "Well, Doug, this was fantastic. You really saved us on this. What can I pay you for the pear wine that we used today?" And he looked at me and he says, "Scott, I don't want you to pay me a single dollar. I just want to work with you for the next 20 years. And I thought, this is a great new industry I'm getting into. What camaraderie, what a wonderful relationship. So it's been really great. And we've enjoyed working with Doug ever since.
Absolutely. And how long was it after becoming established that you could join Becky in the business?
Yeah, it was a couple years in, 2-3 years in. So essentially, I was still working my day job as a government contractor for the U.S. Navy, working 40 hours a week at work and then coming home in the evening and doing business items in the evening. Becky working full time, distilling, making zero salary. We weren't making any money on the business yet. So I was fully supported by my day job. And then a couple years in, I cut my time down to 3/4 time, and then cut my time down again to half time. And basically at one point, I was sitting in my office, and I realized I was more concerned about what was happening at the whiskey distillery than I was at the day job. And I thought, well, it's probably time to go. And it was quite a frightening move to make. They have the old saying about Cortez: when he landed in the New World, he burned the ships. There was no option to go back. And so my thought was, well, if I don't make the chance now to try this full time, then I never will. So I cut loose from my day job about 2-3 years into it, and we haven't looked back since. So we're supporting ourselves and now 20 employees. So
yeah, I think it clearly works. I think in 2015 you had that sort of the business decision that, as well as America, you really need to have a presence in Europe. And I believe you invested sort of $100,000 into getting into Europe. I'm intrigued. Why does it cost $100,000? Obviously, I can understand plane flights, hotels, but 100 grand is a lot of money. What else is involved in that process that perhaps I'm not realizing?
Yeah, so the $100,000 we spent investing in European market was over the course of, say, 5 years or so. So, every couple of years, a flight, fees for the conferences, and paying for new labels, the consultant that we used for doing trade shows and things in Europe. So all of that adds up pretty quickly, actually.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's just an intriguing amount of the cost of doing business. And you mentioned labels there. I know that's one thing that, I don't know if regret's the right word, but you hadn't realized how important branding actually was initially. So how much time did you actually spend on your labels, and even like the process of finding the design agency, I guess, to create them for you?
Yeah, if there was one thing I that you wish you knew when you started that you know now. It's like being, if I went back to high school now, I would be deadly with the ladies because now I know so much more. But, back in the day, we didn't know anything about branding with alcohol. And so we had a very simple engineering focus on the branding, which was we'll put everything factual that needs to be on the label. But the labels will be quite generic looking, and the liquid inside will be immaculate. That was our thought, and the liquid was immaculate. But we didn't realize how very important labeling is, and so it was a process. It was a journey over the, say, 7 or 8 years that we were doing this. That our original labels were done in Microsoft Word, and today when I see them, I just absolutely shudder with shame, that they look so terrible, but that's our story, and that's our reality. Then we went to a local guy who knew a little bit more about Photoshop and things like that, and he designed some labels for us. And in some ways, I confess that those are probably even worse, because they looked like clip art, and so
Really?
that was really bad. So, and it was actually in Europe at these trade shows that I learned that. I was at a whiskey show, and I had a Irish bartender who worked on the Champs-Élysées in Paris, who came into my booth and tasted our whiskey and said, "This is lovely stuff. This is some of the best rye whiskey I've ever had." And then he looked at the bottle and he says, "And I will never have this in my bar." And I was absolutely gutted. What do you mean? He says, "It looks like you printed it on an inkjet printer, and it looks terrible." And he just said it straight out. The Irish are very open and
Yeah.
frank.
Yeah.
And so I went home in a deep depression. And finally, again, Becky is a wonderful check on my ambitions. And she basically, again, told me, she's like, "Look, that guy did you a favor. He told you the truth." And that was when we decided to commence a redesign of our labels, the whole set of them. Ultimately, we spent about $60,000 using an agency to totally redesign the labels from the ground up, with all kinds of sort of subliminal things that go into it, and the choice of fonts, and the historical aspects that are tied into the labels that maybe nobody ever even notices, but they all sort of give a feeling for what we're trying to convey. And we're really, really pleased with where they are now.
And so was that 1.6 or 6.0?
1.6,
16,000 or 60,000?
60,000.
Wow. Wow.
$60,000.
Wow. Yeah.
It was a lot of money.
Yeah.
But it was a complete, design firm who, did up all of the Illustrator and vector graphics and everything. So, it's not cheap.
Really paid off. I know you've got a program, or you're starting a program to help young entrepreneurs get into the spirits business. Is that something that's still developing or launched?
Yeah, that's actually a pet project of my wife. My wife is the president of the American Craft Spirits Association, which is our national firm, our national nonprofit that helps the community of 3,000 distillers across the United States. And one of their projects is called Step Up. I think it's stepup.org. And that's basically an organization to help young people who want to get into craft distilling, who come from disadvantaged communities, to get into it. And they may be already in the industry. Maybe they're a salesperson or they work as a bartender, but they'd really like to get into production, distilling, bottling, blending, things like that. Then this is a program for them to be able to get in there. Because sometimes, quite frankly, it's not what you know or how capable you are, it's who you know. And so putting those connections together is really, really helpful. And so that's a pet project of my wife's.
Absolutely. And then I know you have you have a bottling workshop you sometimes do. I read. Talk to that. I just got pictures coming. It must be more than just filling bottles by hand. What does it involve?
Yeah, it's actually a fun little workshop. You get to see the whole back end of the processing operation. So we start with a drum of whiskey, and we have a small hand bottler that has 4 spigots, and we will bottle that and then label it, cork it, seal it, write the batch numbers on it, and they get to do all of that themselves. And it's quite an active little workshop that we do, about 30 people per month. and it's fun. They get to say, you know, I want to buy a bottle of this and write on the label that I bottled it myself and give it to my father for Father's Day or for Christmas or
Lovely.
something like that. So it's a nice little activity, and you know, it's free and people can come in and do it. We used to do it as necessity because that was how we bottled everything, but now we actually have automated bottling. And we stopped doing the workshops for a time, and then people complained. They said, "Hey, we love those workshops. Why don't you keep doing them?" So we started them back up, and now they're purely for fun, for public outreach and marketing.
And tell me about, you just had I think you just invested another £1 million in the $1 million, sorry, into the distillery.
Yeah.
What did you buy? What does $1 million buy you?
So we had a complete revamping of the equipment in the distillery. So let's see, about 3/4 of the equipment was replaced completely. So we took out our original pot still. So that was quite nostalgic to take the original pot still that we bought out, the original mash tank, and then the 6 fermenters that we had purchased. All of those went to a new distillery starting in West Virginia, and that made room in the building for our 2,000-liter pot still, our 2,000-liter mash tank, and 6 2,000-liter fermenters, plus plant improvements that were really necessary. In this 100-year-old building, we had to completely redo the concrete floors. The concrete floors before were 100 years old. They were, you know, 1 centimeter thick in places, and I joke they were made out of horsehair and chalk. So you know, they were really poor. And then we also bought a big chiller, which is a closed loop glycol system that we use for cooling all the equipment. So that's going to save us a great deal of money on coolant. And then also some other accessories like a big stillage tank that we use to give the spent rye mash to the local farmers. So they come and we can fill up their tanks and their trucks out front with a hose.
And will this make a difference to the new make spirit?
Yeah, so actually we're just underway with that. We've had a couple of weeks now of production with the new system, and we're very pleased with the spirit. You know, we designed the system, it's a custom built system, to be as close to what we had before, just larger capacity. And the new make spirit does taste quite similar to the old new make spirit. There's just twice as much of it coming out now. Obviously, it'll take a few years for us to really hone in on what that develops like in the barrel. But Becky can usually tell from the new make what it's going to be like, and I think she's quite pleased.
And finally, what do you have a particular percentage of barrels you will keep back for further aging, or is it really a case on just the very, very best barrels which don't even go into your cask rye that you're holding back?
Yeah, no, we do. For us, all spirits going into the barrel have to be known a priori before we even put them in the barrel what they're going to end up to be. So the vast majority of our product, our flagship line, is the Roundstone Rye line, and that's a relatively young aged rye whiskey in the style of the 1800s. So you were talking 2-3 years old. Purpose made to that with virgin wood, so that wood really impacts the whiskey a lot, especially in our hot Virginia climate. So it is really apples and oranges. When people are used to aging, they're used to Scotch, and Scotch is of course 10, 12, 18, but it's a very maritime climate, and I should point out it's a reused cask.
Yeah.
So it's like using a tea bag the second or third time. The tea is not as strong as it was in the beginning. We have to use a new cask every single time by law. So it puts a lot of wood into that whiskey very, very quickly. So the Roundstone Rye line will always be, you know, 2-3 years old, but we a few years ago began developing our older aging line, which is our Rabble Rouser line. So that's our bottled in bond product. Earliest ones of that were coming out at 4 years old. And now we've got stuff coming out 5 and 6 years old, and we'll let that one age for a bit longer. We do still have to be quite mindful of the hot Virginia climate. The first year that we pulled Rabble Rouser out at 4 years old, the angel share was 30%.
Whoa.
30%. So 30 gallons goes into the barrel and 20 gallons comes out. That is devastating. Yeah, that is devastating. So that's why aging for 12 or 15 years in a Virginia climate is just not going to happen. You'd have nothing left.
No. Yeah, that's crazy. Thank you very much indeed for your time. I'm going to put obviously details in the article anyway. We put them on screen as well in case anyone's watching this interview elsewhere. But yeah, next time out in Washington, I'm going to come and visit you and taste through the range, buy a bottle, and I don't know, sit by a river and enjoy it with some cheese.
That's the way to do it. That would be great. It'd be our pleasure.
Thank you very much indeed. Cheers.
Thank you, David.